Yeah, so I thank you all for coming out on this busiest day of this busiest year on a cold, unpleasant evening. So it's really lovely to see you all. And we're also being joined tonight by hundreds of Zoom registrants, so we can wave hello to them. Anyway, I am Nicole Vlado-Torres. I'm the co-chair of the AI New York Housing Committee, and I want to welcome you on behalf of our committee and on behalf of the AIA New York and the Center for Architecture for, I think, a really beautiful event. And also, even though we're a fairly intimate group in this room, we are again joined by perhaps over 300 participants from Zoom, which is a testament of the impact of this collaboration with the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. So excited for tonight. And especially that we're having this conversation about housing in New York City following the sort of monumental vote that we just all learned about at 5 p.m. today that the City Council has passed, the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. And anyone who's been involved with the Housing Committee or anyone in this room thinking about housing spent the last 2 years and especially the last few months entirely focused on this zoning change. So, I really love the name suggesting that this is an opportunity. We have the opportunity to build more housing. We have the opportunity to correct imbalances that our earlier versions of housing created for New York City. And while the change is tremendous in its scale in terms of how many words have been changed in the zoning text, it's not that fundamentally different in terms of what we will see, right, in terms of the change to the urban fabric of New York City. And I think that's important, that the ethos of the zoning change is really about increasing supply consistent with respective contexts. And I think that's a lot of what we'll talk about today, that we've got varied fabrics across New York City, and we're asking each of those neighborhoods to sort of increase their bulk a little in different ways. And these are subtle changes again, ADUs, transit-oriented design. They're new to New York City, but they're not innovations in housing design or urban planning. So what the Joint Center's report that we're going to talk about today illustrates so beautifully is that these are typologies and practices that are being used all around the country. But we are here in New York City, and as architects working in New York City, and I know I'm one of them, always feel like we're confronted with the constraints of New York, our limited footprint, all of the challenges that we have with our very cold winters, our very hot summers. And so when we see other examples of housing outside of New York, we often do that sort of grumbly thing where we say we can't do that in New York. And I grumbled on a phone call with Sam and others from the Joint Center earlier this year, trying to think about, well, how can we show off all of these great projects and not really be able to understand the implication for how they could be considered for New York City. But now with this zoning change, we actually do get to consider that. And so, we're really imagining small and mid-sized projects in a way that we haven't before. We're not just building to the maximum of a term sheet. We're not just looking at projects that are 200 plus units. And that invites us, again, for the opportunity as architects to continue to learn, to perhaps think about scales that many of us haven't been, or to focus on them in different ways and in different contexts. So I'm super excited for us to think about that today. Again, I'm going to pass the microphone to our colleagues at the Joint Center in just a second, but I do want to just pay note to the fact that today's conversation is going to be between an architect, a developer, and a journalist, which really captures the essence of how the book itself is organized, the report. There's a display copy out front, and hopefully folks will have a chance to get it themselves. You can look at the entire document online as a PDF. But yeah, this is this really beautiful and compelling, accessible urban design, architectural, and really a cultural study, right? It's doing all of those things. This is not just a report that's giving you stats about housing. This is really thinking about over 100 projects organized around 25 frameworks. We have, playful and intriguing themes with titles like Disguise, Density, and Marginalia, and essays from writers, mostly journalists, including Stephen Zacks, who's joining us today, who is based here in New York City and is a regular contributor to Oculus. And two of the other panelists are dear colleagues of mine. So Juan Barahona, who is both a client and a mentor, and my incredible co-chair for the Housing Committee, Brian Laughlin. So I'm so excited to be a member of this audience this evening, and I'm going to pass the mic to Chris Herbert, who is the managing director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, who will tell you more about his team and their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. We're really thrilled to be here. I really appreciate Nicole and Brian and other folks here at the AAA New York and the Center for Architecture for your partnership. For those of you who don't know, the Joint Center for Housing Studies is a research center that's been around for 65 years. We're probably best known for a report we do called the State of the Nation's Housing, which has come out every year since the late 1980s. We do similar reports like that on rental housing, on improving America's housing, on housing America's older adults, all of which take a very, as Nicole was describing, data-intensive view of painting a picture about housing. And while we pride ourselves on being multidisciplinary, the real glaring failure of our work to date has been we rarely have ever talked about design, the physical housing unit, and housing is nothing if not a physical object. And so because of the fact that we are housed at the Graduate School of Design, and yet haven't done that, we were urged by our colleagues there, by the dean, by Rahul Malhotra, to leverage our State of the Nation's Housing brand to do a State of Housing Design report. But not being designers ourselves, we said, well, how would we do that? And so we turned to our colleagues at the Graduate School of Design, Sam Naylor, who you'll hear from in a minute, and I'll say a bit more to introduce him, who was an alum of the Graduate School of Design and a Drucker Fellow, to Dan Dioka, who's on the faculty of the Graduate School of Design and a founding partner of Interborough Partners in New York, to really lead the charge on conceiving of a report that would take stock of trends in housing design, to look at building that was actually constructed, and not just beautiful housing, but housing that was addressing important social issues, issues of affordability, issues of sustainability, issues of how do we foster community, how do we serve the needs of diverse and special needs populations, how do we get housing that's different than is just being produced through a market rate process. And so I think Sam and Dan and a team of students, I should say, two of whom were here, Aaron Smithen and Emily C., who were part of a group of students who did a lot of the work of this report, scanned the world to find, or scanned the US to find examples of these, and then created themes, and we engaged with journalists to help then illuminate and illustrate those themes. What we hope in doing this as the Joint Center is we have a world of folks who are interested in policy or policy-oriented folks, but bring that world and the world of design together, because issues of housing affordability are a classic wicked problem, one that is complex and defies simple solutions. And if we're going to design solutions, they have to draw on multiple disciplines. And so I think we're really gratified tonight to have our world, the world of architecture and design, come together to have this conversation. So let me then just introduce Sam. Sam is an architect, educator, and researcher. He's currently an associate at the design firm Util. He's a Drucker Traveling Fellow at Harvard, where he recently gave a lecture on his work looking at co-op housing from around the world. He's a frequent collaborator of ours. We just recently finished a report with Util looking at a single egress building code and how that could be expanded to support more mid-rise housing in Boston. Sam's work is dedicated to the goal of ensuring that everyone has access to homes that are dignified, affordable, and delightful. I love that expression, and I have to say that Sam has been a wonderful partner. It's been delightful to work with you, Sam. So let me turn over to Sam, who will say more about the work. So, Sam, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see here. My changes, great. Thank you all for being here. This is a really nice space. I've never been here before. So we're going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'll key up the conversation for the panel. This is some imagery to go along with what Chris is saying about the Joint Center's work and the variety of reports they do. This is the last year's State of the Nation's Housing, but the next one is online for free. And also to follow on the magnitude of people it took to make this book, and to pay thanks to everyone involved, some of whom are here tonight. It's a lot easier to write a book when you don't write all of the book. And so we were grateful to have partners and journalists, 9 of them who wrote the primary text, and then a normal studio out of Chicago who did most of the graphic design and made the book look the way it was. So, Chris gave a little background on where the book came from in terms of its inception, but for the framing of how we conceived of like how we want to talk about housing as a survey of the nation, we were confronted with trying to meld together, the typical Joint Centers report, which is more survey-based, quantitative, and also with a design publication was more qualitative and project-based. But then also, like as an architect who reads a lot of literature about housing, it's really true that either when you read online, a lot of it talks too much about politics or development maybe, or about the project's outcome, about the struggles of density, not enough about design. And then when there's articles about design, very often they're about projects that haven't been built, or projects abroad, or projects of super luxury quality somewhere else. So we were interested to talk about development, politics, implementation, and also about design of mid-rise multifamily American housing, which is the DNA of our cities, and the stuff that's not only got to be built in greater quantities for affordability, but must be built with greater design if we're to make our cities places more folks want to live for their entire lives. We used projects themselves as the DNA of the book. It sort of starts and ends with projects. These are some of them. There's a wide range: urban, rural, suburban, and different coasts in every region of the country. We chose specifically to limit our criteria to projects that are built and occupied, have been built in the last 3 years, and are of some sort of novel or interesting design quality. And so that was, the genesis. Of course, we debated and changed criteria over time. We culled the ultimate list from over 400 projects to about 113 in the book. This is where they are. We tried to be geographically diverse. Next time we'll get Alaska, for sure, and Florida. And we also wanted to be diverse in who's contributing to projects. This is them in the list, which is in the back of the book, and it was a really helpful thing to have for us as well for our practice. So those are the projects, that's the DNA of the book, but rather than a case study format, which is how a typical design publication might look at housing, where you just have the project and the drawings and then separately an essay about practice or struggles we face, we wanted to blend the two things together and look at the ideas that run through housing. And so in that, we created themes. There's 26 themes in the book, and it's really about design themes and housing that cut across projects to reveal similarities, but also differences when you have the same theme or idea being executed in different contexts, reveals a lot about design. In those themes, 9 of them really came to us first and felt primary, let's say, and more important, had more projects behind them as the quote evidence. So we invited 9 journalists to write about these themes. This is sort of what that looks like. So on the left you have, on the brown pages, our contribution, a preface. We also selected the projects in consultation with the contributors. And then at the end, floor plans of all the projects, which are drawn a little differently depending on the theme. And then in the middle, an essay where each author has quotes and interviews and photos from the projects, really dissects how they came to be and their impact on the community. It was, really great to hear at our report release event, which was almost a year ago, which is crazy, that the great reception we heard from, including design journalists as a facet. And it was important to us from the start to not just have academics or practitioners write about housing. I mean, as much as we love to, there's always a kind of angle and an agenda to talk about your own work or something. And so it was exciting to specifically reach out to design journalists who could bring a sort of unbiased opinion and maybe reveal a new through line to the projects. So those are the 9 primary themes. There's also 16 we might call minor themes. I think equally important to us, but perhaps had a few less projects as their data sets. And so those are inter-sliced between, so the book has this sort of rhythm. And again, on the brown pages by us, there is always an essay with a companion graphic drawing. We have different types of drawings throughout: plans, section, axon perspective, diagram through time. And then each of the projects on a theme from 2 to 5 are drawn at the same scale and style, so you can really look across them and between them. Some of the themes, we have SROs, ADUs, 3D printing, mass timber, self-built, crowdsourcing, and more. And there's also a lot of rejected themes that will be interesting fodder for the next report. Things that didn't quite feel like, I mean, they're happening, but maybe there's not built examples or they weren't part of a cohesive narrative yet, but something to noodle on for the future. And so that's the meat of the book and the report, and it can be read, I think, you can kind of start anywhere and go front or back, but we do have at the very beginning a survey, which is exciting. The Joint Center has a wide reach, so we got over 1,300 responses to a survey asking people around the country who work on housing 4 broad questions about what they're seeing. So we heard, you can see in orange, mostly where we heard from, it was in a large part designers and mid-career professionals. We asked broadly about trends, barriers, things people would change, and then materiality and details they're seeing in housing. And just broadly, I mean, in terms of trends, people mostly talked about density and size of things changing. In barriers, it was all about the cost of construction. People would change zoning, for sure, is the #1 thing across the country, and we're doing it. And it was also kind of interesting to hear about material details and how maybe there's a lot of East Coast craftsman buildings in South Carolina, but then a lot of West Coast high contrast multifamily podium exteriors in California and Oregon. I thought I'd just bring out a couple themes, have some poll quotes that I think are really relevant for what we're going to talk about tonight. So the first one, which is the first one in the book, is Disguised Density by Mimi Ziegler, a Los Angeles-based critic. And she writes about this theme, this design tactic, where you try to fit in to hide the real density of a project, both urbanistically and architecturally. And among the projects she singles out, 2 follow LA's zoning change, which happened some years ago, small lot subdivision ordinance, which reduced setback requirements and lot sizes. There's the Canyon Drive project by Loha, the Reserves at Gray Park by Duval Decker, the Outpost by B.B. Skidmore, and a couple others. And what was really interesting is that she points out that this tactic, perhaps, is a good solution, but for a problem that perhaps shouldn't exist. Quote, that new development must slip quietly into a neighborhood underlines the long-held entitlement of homeownership and bias of single-family zoning. And so what she's talking about is that this is an architectural solution to an urban problem, but it's also a reflection of our collective inability to move past urban imaginaries of the bungalow, cabin, or house, to move past the distributed model of development that built much of the country post-war. And so disguised density is a double-edged sword. It relieves the burden of solving density for the neighborhood while achieving it at the site, but in so doing forgoes the longer, perhaps harder collective conversation about how and what neighborhood should look like in a time that requires change. Some of the minor themes that might be relevant for tonight, we talk about, the 5/1, the podium. This is really evident in Boston and where I work in New England, where the high-rise threshold, which is artificially lowered by 5 feet for some reason, and lightwood frame construction over a podium determines the bulk of new housing, and so there's a kind of monotony to the scale of all new multifamily, and so we looked at a few projects that broke that rule, or at least did that rule really well. I think it's maybe less of a case in New York, where non-combustible construction and high-rise codes are slightly different. We also talked about ADUs, obviously one of the biggest topics around the country. There's a lot of excellent ways these are being implemented from, in the largest one in Denver, a kind of cluster which utilizes a new small lot subdivision zoning change to prefabricated ones, to ones being designed and built by city architects, to other ones, self-built ones. And then interesting ways in which, as I mentioned, cities themselves are becoming the author again in some cases and drawing pre-approved plans, pre-approved projects for the communities to further streamline the regulatory entitlement process, which is often cited also as a barrier to small projects. And we also talk about mass timber and how it can be, I mean, I think it's quite relevant for New York, where it's most advantageous, or the argument is usually to be made that it's good to be replacing steel or concrete as a substitute because it has equal structural strength, and I think we're moving towards that being economical. But in the end, it's always a hybrid situation, so we were curious to diagram and talk about the complexities in mass timber. It's still, everything is a heterogeneous construction. And lastly, just to talk about Stephen's theme, which was community-led development. And this essay really looked at specific needs of diverse community types and user groups. It focused on projects, huge variety, single-family homes on sovereign Lakota land in South Dakota, studios and tiny houses for formerly homeless people in Iowa City, San Diego, and Seattle, multi-generational live-work lofts for Hispanic makers and creative workers in Santa Fe, and duplexes and townhomes for farm workers in Southern California's Central Valley. I think what was really amazing to read is the depth of funding specifics, complexity in the project's implementation and capital stack, very, very long development model, but also the user-specific design moves that were taken and specifically based on the people who live there and in concert with the people who live in the project, which is not always something we get to do in a LIHTC funded affordable project where the people that live there is through lottery. I'll just briefly quote Stephen, quote, "Increasingly, commentators, advocates, and policymakers blame restrictive zoning regulations, suggesting that the market will magically produce adequate supply without these restrictions. All other things being equal, many community-led developers and architects agree that restrictive zoning plays a significant role in limiting housing supply in many places, but limited access to capital for construction and funding for supportive services constitutes a huge under-acknowledged factor in reduced production." And so he concludes that we need to think about, in our definition, or we need to think about our definition of what it really means resources-wise to design for a or the community. Because looking at examples that do it right, they require significant expertise and resources so that projects that do not fail and to lead to negative narrative around public housing that led to our current crisis. So that's the book. And I thought I had a couple of slides to key up our conversation, also some of them coming from Joint Center and UTL research. This is from our single-stair report, and I don't know a lot about New York, so if I say anything at all about anything, just forgive me. But this is, in our report about single-stair housing in New England and Boston, we really wanted to make the narrative about that regulatory change could lead to better small-scale infill housing, which we don't see a lot of, and this proved that out. So this is a chart of every housing unit built in the last 20 years. On the left, on the y-axis, is the number of units in the building, and the bottom is the number of units built by that building. And so you can see through a lot of threshold limits, a lot of them entitlement-wise, but a couple building code-wise, and I'm sure construction costs folds in there. Because of those, there's really not much built greater than 9 units or less than 30. This is also something that has been growing as perhaps an issue, if you think it's an issue over time, where, this doesn't even show because it's so light, but the majority of projects post-war were, 80% or so were 2 to 20 units, and now that's only 20% of the new housing stock. And the majority is in the 50 or more unit mid-rise podium construction. Cost is obviously a really big reason, and through this research, we partnered or were able to get insight from research from the Center for Building in North America, which showed how other countries, the cost of construction does not necessarily scale in the same way when you become more dense or go higher. And so naturally, you'd think there would be efficiencies you get with adding units. You can multiply things. There's efficiencies in the soft costs for architecture work, I think we know. But at least in Canada and the United States, it gets more expensive per square foot to build denser. But that same trend is not true in other countries. So that's New England a little bit. Some of our challenges with missing middle. For New York, Nicole keyed up a little bit of what's happening. I mean, this map, this narrative led to the title of the event, where the majority of new affordable housing and just new housing in general is built mostly in 10 neighborhoods. And then there's 41 which receive a lot less of it. And these are from the City of Yes report, but part of the narrative is that there's not been the requisite increase in housing as people have been moving here or jobs have been created. And that the City of Yes is hoping zoning, also a lot of other tools, can really be there to unlock that. And this map on the right, I think, is a interesting invert of the previous one, where there's a lot of zoning changes happening exactly in the neighborhoods which have had less housing. And exactly as was said earlier, this probably doesn't really result in a massive fundamental change to what the city will look like, but it's a lot of incremental, smaller development that I think is really interesting and impactful and also easier to swallow, but as we'll probably hear about tonight, very hard to do for a lot of physical reasons. So thank you. We're just gonna roll on through. If you guys wanna come up, and I'll introduce the panelists. Brian Lowen is a principal at Magnuson Architecture and Planning, where he has worked on almost every scale of housing design and has a focus on community-based planning and human-centered affordable housing design. He also has over 15 years of previous experience in public housing and the nonprofit sector, and Brian is co-chair of the Housing Committee who's co-hosting us. Juan Barahona is the founder of SMJ Development, an organization dedicated to the development and preservation of affordable housing in the city. Previously, he has been working in the affordable housing industry, both public and private, since 2001, both at the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development's Division of New Construction and at BFC Partners. He self-advertises as being uniquely suited to tackle complex sites and complicated projects in the context of an archaic regulatory landscape, which I think we might hear more about. And Stephen Zacks is an advocacy journalist, architecture critic, urbanist, and project organizer based in New York City. He founded Flint Public Art Lab, and serves as president of Amplifier Incorporated, a non-governmental organization that employs emerging ideas, media, design, and aesthetic strategies to advance alternative political and economic frameworks and institutional transformation. He has been widely published in every magazine, newspaper, and media you can think of, and was a contributor to the State of Housing Design publication. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. We have some images in case we need them. Try these. Hello. Great. Thank you all for coming. Well, I thought we'd start with Brian and maybe start by acknowledging the status quo. So Brian, at MAP, you work on a lot of housing projects, and from what I can tell, most are about 9 to 13 stories tall. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about where that threshold comes from. What are the largest factors in determining the size of new affordable housing built in the city, and also where it's built?
Sure. 9 to 13, I think, is no longer the status quo. I think it was for a very long period of time, and that what we've seen in our office in the last 5 years is kind of a move in two directions. We've seen a real emphasis on larger buildings with more units, and I think that speaks a little bit to limited community and limited city resources, and so there's an interest in trying to get as much out of city agencies on kind of a per project basis. The 9 to 13 though comes kind of from a very delicate balance between construction typologies, available financing, and zoning. So a lot of it is driven by land cost and where you can afford to build affordable housing, and that is largely in R6, R7 neighborhoods, which have zoning that allow for 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-story buildings. But then also when you think about the construction typology that a lot of affordable housing in New York City relies on, which is block and plank, that really can't go above 11, 12, or 13 stories. So there is this, and I think a lot of things in the affordable housing industry in New York City reflect this, is that it is that delicate balance between finance, politics, and construction and design.
I'm going to ask you more later about like that construction type and also maybe about small scale buildings, but we're going to keep going around the horn a little bit. Okay. So Juan, you recently completed the East 12th Street project in Manhattan, which is only, there it is, 6 stories, and it's probably a dozen feet wide. And I hear it took almost a decade to come from concept to completion, but was done this past spring. Can you tell us a little bit about the project, some of the hurdles as they relate to the size and formation of the building, but also the community who's living there?
Sure. So the this project, it's a 2-site project, 12th Street and around the corner on Avenue A, and this was these were 2 city-owned lots that the city acquired in the 70s through in rem foreclosure, but they were occupied buildings, so the city was the landlord for 10 households for close to 30, 40 years. And then in the 80s, there was this program created called the Tenant Interim Lease Program, where if you were a tenant of a city-owned building and you kind of organized yourself, you had the ability to enter into this program, and then they would hook you up with a sponsor. The sponsor would help you rehabilitate your building, and then the tenants would become the owners of the buildings. So, and then the purchase price for the existing tenants was like $250. So these were promises made in the 90s, like late 80s, 90s, and so the program was just hanging out there for forever and ever and ever. And with this particular project, the Bloomberg administration really didn't care about these smaller projects, right? So there was 12 years where nothing happened, and then I started working on this in I think it was 2015, 2014. The local council member, and these particular tenants were very organized, like much more so than anybody I've ever met. And they were just really persistent, and they got the local city council member to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so we finally, but these are city-owned properties, so it's not just a simple conveyance. I think everybody here is familiar with the term ULURP, right? So one of the actions in a ULURP that's non-design related is the disposition of city-owned property. And so once you start talking about that people kind of come out of the woodwork, and there's a lot of reasons that people suggest for why this project shouldn't happen, or shouldn't happen by a guy like me who's a for-profit. Should be happen. Like, why can't the tenants build it themselves? And you have to kind of answer all these kind of impractical questions about, it's like, do you want this to happen, or do you just want to keep figuring out reasons not to make it happen? So long story short, we finished ULURP in 16, and then we finally closed on the financing. Sorry, we finished the ULURP in 17. We closed on the financing in December of 2019. And there were 2 existing buildings that we had to demolish because they were in such bad condition that the city ordered them vacated. So we figured out it would make more sense to build new buildings versus to rehab the original buildings. Plus, they were also underbuilt. And then we just kind of ran headfirst. I mean, I had 3 months before COVID hit, and then everything just kind of went sideways on me. This building was a little more manageable because there is no cellar here. So this is 25 feet wide, 6 stories. This is R8, I think R8B. So, not, you know, I think I'm still your client now on this, but I was, yeah, I was Nicole's client. So and the you know, the typology here, you know, it's 10 one-bedrooms and 1 studio unit on the first floor. You know, approximately 450 square feet. That's Avenue A. Approximately 450 square feet front and back. I mean, I think we kind of did what we could here. I mean, we just, you know, we have a 25-footer, right? I mean, elevator, trash room. Yeah, I mean, you know, we need, in New York, I don't even know over what height we have to provide stretcher-size elevators, right? So the elevator is enormous, right? The trash room has to be ADA, so that's also big. So that, you know, we have 1 stairwell here, so we make it work, right? And Avenue A, because we went to 7 stories, we have 2 stairs, so the apartments got even smaller. In Avenue A, the original households are all moving back to this building, which is actually finished now. I'm trying to get the gas hooked up, and then I'm gonna be fighting with the Department of Buildings for a TCO for the next 6 weeks so that I can move these people. So the folks are gonna get their promise. It's actually a little better. They're gonna get their units for $2,500, brand new apartments in the East Village. They're gonna become owners in a cooperative here, right? And so they will have made it all the way. There are a lot of other folks in the program who have not been that organized, who haven't been able to get across the finish line. And the unfortunate part is that, you know, the projects and these situations only become more expensive as time goes on. And so these are fully subsidized buildings. So this is a low-income cooperative. You know, the maximum AMI for those that, you know, the area median income is 80%, which is pretty low for the East Village, if you're familiar with the East Village now. The other building on 12th Street is a middle-income rental that was kind of was done that way to kind of offset some of the costs of this building, because all these units are spoken for. I did some quick math. We ended up at $650 a square foot for this building on Avenue A, and about $500 a foot, give or take, on 12th, primarily because of the cellar. So you'll never know, but there are 80 piles in Avenue A in 25 feet. I mean, we had water at 7 feet, and our cellar was 10 feet. So we had to, you know, the foundation, you know, I don't even know how I made it through the foundation phase. It was torture. It was torture. I mean, we got audited by the Department of Buildings, so we had to stop. I mean, it was just everything that could go wrong went wrong. I had the building on the left started moving during that, you know, so it just became very difficult. So I'm very thankful that I'm here showing you a finished building. But this typology, this like 25-footer is pretty. There's a lot of this opportunity in New York, and especially in Manhattan. But they're going to be pretty expensive buildings to make work without being affordable housing, without the heavy subsidy that we got from the city. The rents would have to be astronomical to even cover the cost, let alone make a return. So that's where the commitment really by the administration and the council member to see this project through, despite the relative expense. I mean, Brian talks about like the financing it's a delicate dance we do as developers with the city agencies on the affordable housing projects. We're trying to they're telling us they have a finite amount of resources dedicated to 100% affordable projects. So we have to find a way to make it work. I think we did a good job here. I wouldn't show up to this place if my buildings look terrible. So I think, so for me, as just a client and as an affordable housing advocate, the design piece is super critical. I mean, there's not much we can do from a layout perspective, right? But at least from the facade, I mean, there's a lot of refereeing that I have to do between the architect and the contractor. But I think at the end of the day, we got something that that doesn't read like affordable housing. If you walked by it, you wouldn't think that was, affordable housing. So I think at least that's my MO, right?
What's the construction type of these?
So this is block, right? Block over, what did we use here? A C-joist. We have block over C-joist, and what was that called? We used this new material. We didn't pour the floors. We used dragon board or dragon. Was it dragon board? Right? Yeah, this kind of dragon board, which was this flooring, this kind of structural floor for membrane. Yeah. So we were able to get a couple of inches back on the floor to finished floor to ceiling height. I mean, look, if anybody wants to, we can go see. We can make it. I'm happy to show people the job. This one is empty, so it's easy to go see it now. The other one is just photos, but and these are electric P-tax. They're not gas. They're not gas powered P-tax. So it's electric heat. Just one last thing on Avenue A. So these folks lived through Sandy. So the East Village was completely flooded, as many may remember. And so the folks had no ability to cook, to do anything. And so I had been pushing for electrification because that's kind of the big push for the city now. And they were adamant that they were like, what if we have another Sandy? And you can't, like, that's like community input that you can't argue with, right? So, we do have, the gas ranges here. So even as we're moving as a city toward decarbonization, there are lived experiences which, as a sponsor, I can't ignore, right? And I can't argue with. But hopefully there is not another Sandy and it'll be fine. But the other building is pretty much all electric.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard similar things, working on a lot more passive house projects, and everything's moving that way, and just a concern when everything's electric, what goes out when the power goes out, and then you have more generators maybe. Just to ask, what was the price per square foot on, Brian, your last building?
We have a lot of buildings.
Or like a tall one?
A tall one.
If those are the...
Yeah, no, it's interesting, not too far off. I mean, a lot of stuff we're seeing right now is clocking in between $500 and $600 a square foot. Okay. The smaller ones are more expensive because for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the city at an agency level, and the city's financing tools are not particularly well geared to streamline a 10-unit, 12-unit, 20, 30-unit project. They can streamline a 200-unit project.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk also a little bit about the size of community. I'm curious in the co-op and like how, when you're starting a new co-op, starting a new condo, small group of residents have to build up the capital in case the roof leaks, or manage a building, which is differently than a large affordable housing project where you have institutional management. And Stephen, in the book, you wrote a lot about different communities, and I'm wondering if you can, I don't know, maybe this is between Juan and Stephen, but maybe the opportunities and limitations of community size can have on the design of the building. And in the book, you talk about how more supportive affordable housing might need to be larger to justify the scale of collective services. And I've also heard similar things from working on senior housing, and you also want 2 elevators, so you can't do a small building that has 1 elevator in case one goes out. So how does that, can there be mid-sized, small scale affordable supportive housing, or how does the scale of community impact the building?
Well, I can only talk based on the research and reporting of looking at other people's projects, but what I was really curious about as a journalist was to ask some of those questions to you about how these types of policies impact your projects, the possibility of making something. There were a lot of those sorts of supportive housing projects that you suggested for the community-led development article, which I mean, I can talk a little bit about things that I discovered through those particulars of projects, like some great new sort of policy frameworks for affordable housing for particular types of communities, like formerly homeless people or people with a set of special needs that requires a more intensive kind of supportive service. It's something that the market doesn't deal with it at all, right? It's not something that you can assume will be built unless there's a public sector involvement. But there are some initiatives of communities, cities, developers trying to appeal to that need, nonprofit sector people to a large extent. The model that I thought was most fascinating, maybe that I wasn't aware of, was to essentially build housing for formerly homeless people where there's no barrier to entry, or there's no way they can get thrown out of it because of the intensive level of services that are involved. So, it implies a huge sort of subsidy. But for instance, like, I'm really curious from your perspectives. You mentioned the new zoning City of Yes framework that was passed today. If you don't mind, I'm really curious from your perspective to what extent you think it will affect your capacity to make things in a way. Like, I would love to get, if I could get past the idea of development as being primarily profit-seeking, and that the motivation of the developer is solely going to be incentivized by some possibility of increasing profit through development. This framework, from what I understand, assumes that if you simply increase the zoning frame in a variety of neighborhoods, that there really is not any other incentive, as far as I can tell. There's a little bit of money that mainly goes towards sewers and other kind of infrastructure. But so my question is, do you see in these kind of residential neighborhoods where there's an increase in zoning allowance for, like, maybe 4 or 5 story buildings, but with a mandate that they have to be 60% AMI, which is a very high standard of affordability, right? That's what I read in what was published by the city. Does that cut out the capacity to finance those units? Who as a developer is thinking, I want to just add units to a lot without having the ability to charge a market rate on it without any other subsidy or incentive? That's I don't really understand how the thinking is for how it's going to produce what now it's supposed to be 80,000 units, which, by the way, having written about this sort of thing for 25 years now, and researching back to the 50s, every administration says that they're going to build 100,000 new units, and it's like really every Koch said 250,000. And I don't know if it happens or not. I would love to see the chart again of what was actually built decade by decade and get a photograph of it. But whether it achieves,
When was Ed Koch?
80s.
that would have been the 80s. But yeah. Anyway, that's my question.
So there's a lot there.
A long question.
Yeah.
Well, you take the whole thing.
We're trying to take it apart one at a time. So I will not pretend to be an expert on the city of Yes. I think even the experts on zoning don't claim to be an expert on the city of Yes. It's, I think Nicole referenced, we're talking somewhere in the ballpark of 1,500 pages of text. I think, and they took out 1,400 pages of text. So it'll take us a while to kind of catch up. I think it's interesting, again, as Nicole referenced, the Housing Committee was involved in a number of discussions at a very granular level to look at what City of Yes meant for different districts, and primarily districts where folks seemed like they were on the fence. It's like, we think it's a good idea, but our constituents don't necessarily like it. And I would, just for simplifying a conversation a little bit, there's a number of different programs. There's the big kid programs, right? R6, R7, which is adding 20% to buildings that are already pretty tall. So you're already talking about 9, 10, 11 story buildings that are getting 20% bigger. You're talking about the ADU and the very, very granular, can you go in your backyard, can't you, level. And then there's the middle stuff. And the middle stuff is what you were referencing, where you have a 3-story building that now, because you no longer need to provide parking for residential units and an extra story, it's now viable. That really starts to feed potentially missing middle, with a component of it being more at 60% of median income. And depending on which district you're in, I mean, that's one of the, like, now that we've tackled the zoning problem, now we need to go focus on the financing problem. So I think, while this was, Mayor Adams was championing this for a while, it really was Speaker Adams that pushed it over the finish line by identifying some of the things that were really upsetting some of the council members that now have voted yes, but also by identifying the fact that you can put all the zoning in the world in there, if you don't have the financing tools to take advantage of that zoning, it's not doing anything. So to kind of jump around your question a little bit, the other thing is, you're going to see projects in R6, R7 districts with that extra 20% and no parking mandate, they're going to fly, right? That is going to really put a booster shot in the arm of affordable housing in those districts. It's going to take a little bit longer and I think anyone that was dreaming of an ADU in their house is probably going for a building permit tomorrow or January 2nd, whatever it is. That middle piece, I think it's going to take us a little while to figure out and determine whether or not this was a successful zoning change. But that's not, the most important of that middle piece is that and this is something we've been saying for a while now, is that it makes affordable housing the responsibility of everybody, right? This is not just a problem for Brownsville to solve or the South Bronx to solve. This is a problem that all in New York City has the opportunity to solve because City of Yes puts tools in the hands of council members and in community boards of whether or not they really want to make affordable housing happen. So.
Maybe we can talk about who is developing those then, because you spoke originally about the financial, there's not like a laneway for those scale of buildings, and it's unclear what's yet going to be the thresholds unlocked. I know in Boston, at least, usually the scale of building, like 3 to 20 units, it's a developer GC in one person, and that way they're able to capture double the fee and then make the low profit work. Is that ring true? Is who are these is it big developers? Is it actually just small shops, people who don't have a network coalition building resources?
Like the 5-story, 3 to 5. Yeah, I don't. I mean, yeah, I'll be honest with you. I am probably not gonna pursue these particular opportunities anymore. I'm just to be honest with everybody here, because I mean, I mean, they're just look, from my perspective, it's the opportunity cost. I mean, I've spent as much time on this project. I mean, look, even removing COVID from the situation and inflation and interest rates and everything, just the regulatory hurdles in New York City, will bankrupt you basically. It's incessant, right? And it doesn't stop. The city council year over year passes new regulations that I'm not sure what there are often solutions in search of a problem, in my opinion. And so the time spent on something like this, I would rather spend on a 100-unit project, because it's going to be the same amount of brain damage, effort, to just and at the end of the day, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to shy away. I'm a profit-driven. I have to I have a family to raise. I have to, et cetera. So that's and I'm not going to live forever. So I don't these projects take 4 or 5 years. I got to focus the time. So I think what City of Yes has done, though, is going to create more entrepreneurship opportunities, and maybe even some community-based collectives will take a run at building something like this. Maybe not here, but in other lower cost neighborhoods, because now there are more opportunities to do these, what they call the town center, the TODs. Like there's going to be more. There's going to be more sites to potentially look at, and then but that doesn't mean that's the developer and the GC. The developer GC has the advantage because they can control the cost, right? The biggest 80% of the project is the hard cost, so they'll be able to manage that piece. But I do think it will stimulate. I agree with Brian. I just don't know how it plays out, because the real estate tax is another conundrum that we have to deal with here. A very weird real estate taxation system that we have that disincentivizes multifamily production, right? And so I think that will kind of play itself out, and I'm optimistic that it will. I mean, we were dealing with a 1962 zoning resolution forever and ever and ever, right? I mean, I've been in situations with architects trying to figure out how to avoid parking, right? Like where hours spent, like what can we do? What trick can we do to avoid parking? And that's just time that are spent on figuring out how to value engineer to get the best design for the best product. So that, I'm a little disappointed that we weren't able to get the entire elimination of the parking mandate, but you can't separate the politics out of the situation either. And Speaker Adams did the best she could, I guess, whipping the votes, right? So
I'll tell you a quick anecdote. We have a project that just got new building approvals, starting to pull permits, about 165 units, and we had to provide parking, and I think it was 11 units, 11 spaces, 10 spaces. So we wedged it down in the bottom of the basement with an elevator and like all these ridiculous gymnastics to stick it in the bottom of the building. And as soon as it looked like City of Yes was going to pass, we got a phone call. Can we get rid of the parking now? So it sounds. I know in outlying districts, parking was a real issue, but it really did handcuff a lot of affordable projects at that scale, right? At the 50 to 150 unit size, that opens up a pretty big door. And the fact that you effectively have universal affordability, because that's the other thing. There is intentional or not, we can have that argument over beers or something, but it concentrated affordable housing in certain pockets that were largely dependent on transit. And so there's the good side of that, but then there's also the not so good side of that, where it meant that only affordable housing was only getting built in certain districts. And now with that universal affordability, it means that it really opens up the opportunity. Because we would have clients that would say, what about this site? It's like, nah, you're 2 blocks over. Sorry, it's not, now you've got that 20% bonus and you don't have to provide parking. That site now becomes viable.
And I'm naive, but how common are zoning variances? Like seeking a variance for.
That's another brutal process in New York. God, that is torture here.
When does it become financially incentivized to seek a zoning variance?
You either have to have city agencies behind you, a community board behind you, or a lot of money behind you. And a lot of money meaning that you just have to be able to carry the site for as long as it takes to get that variance. Yeah. And that's one of the things that if you're kind of going into the subtext to this piece of zoning change that just passed. Part of what the city realized is how much time they were spending on ULURPs to effectively achieve in these little pockets what this achieves. Because you're still going to have the ULURP that's looking for a 50%, 100%, 200% change in density, and those are different animals. But most of what was being sought is 2 more floors, 10 more units, that sort of thing. Yeah, or a parking waiver, and so this hopefully means that city planning can now focus on other things.
So the ULURP process is, charter mandated to be 7 months long. But you can spend 18 to 24 months just to start that process with the Department of City Planning. And then, forget about if you own the property or if you're in contract or whatever, you're carrying the property. And then, hundreds of thousands of dollars of professional fees to submit an application that kind of meets the technical requirements that they need to be able to certify that. So, Brian's 100% right. There's a universe of projects that just did that. Yeah. And just sucked it up, and that's just money flushed down the toilet, which would have been better spent on the actual project, right? So now, City of Yes didn't take an industrial section of Brooklyn and convert it to residential, right? If you want to do that, if you think that there's an industrial site and you'd be a great candidate for a residential site for whatever reason, then you kind of take that on. That risk is still on you to go down that path of a 24-month, and there really is no good reason. Everybody blames the environmental review at city planning. It's just
a good reason why it takes so long.
Yeah. There's not. Nicole knows me as a client is very demanding to why. So I'm not even demanding of her as an architect, but more of the frustration that I would feel okay, we have to submit this application to the DEP. Why does it take 10 weeks for the Department of Environmental Protection to approve my connection to the city sewer or to the city's water system? It just does, because that's just what it is. The Parks Department, I have to go through the street trees, right? Forget about the fire department and signing off a job at the end. It's just, all of those little pieces, they all add up, right? And so,
which for some of the slides up there's a 200-unit project on the right, and I think 500-unit project, almost 500-unit project on the left. Going through that process for that size of building makes a lot of sense. Let's go. But when you're doing it if you go to the next slide, this is a scattered site where we're working with the Northwest Bronx Coalition of Communities and Churches, which is also the Bronx Land Trust. So these 4 sites are being given by the city to the Bronx Land Trust. Across the 4 sites, it's 30 units. So it's the exact opposite scale. The amount of time and effort that has gone into so here it's not a ULURP, it's a UDAP. which is a disposition as opposed to a zoning change, is taking as long, if not longer, than the other two projects.
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory approval piece is now going to need to catch up with what the zoning just changed, or else we're just going to be having this discussion, 10 years from now. Why are only 40,000 of the 80,000 built?
Right.
Well, because it still takes 12 weeks to get out of the DP, right? So, I mean, it's just that. And I just wanted to briefly respond to one thing about the supportive housing piece. I think the supportive housing model works better at scale, truthfully, just because it's often on-site services. And on-site services, in like a 12th Street, we don't have the office space to be able to have the very private meetings that often need to happen between a caseworker and a tenant in need. And so you build and plan for those bigger projects, and even the service providers themselves, many whom are also in the housing development space, are kind of like looking at it also from like an economies of scale situation where we need to dedicate the time and resources we have to where we think we can have the most impact. But there is definitely a push. I think supportive housing is probably done best in New York City, nationwide, because there's a large universe of providers serving different populations, and also there is a good amount of financial support coming at the state and city level.
If you don't mind,
You're the journalist.
digging into that side of it, because we talked a lot about the zoning side of it, and my gripe, as you know, is that it tends to be, we tend to focus more on zoning than on all the other aspects of what makes a project come together. Among them, I'm fascinated by the financing side and how you get access to capital to make something happen. In your description of the process, I think that was maybe 2 years of it, something like that.
Putting the deal together, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you get access to capital to do an unusual project like that? And I don't know. Should we be thinking about ways of expanding that? And by the way, one of the things that we often don't mention in these kind of technocratic discussions or design-focused discussions is that there's a national policy framework that is so much more impactful than anything that people do locally. And you maybe have a central bank that suddenly decides that they don't want economic activity to be happening for an extended period of time, and they don't distinguish between the need for housing and all the other consumer spending. So they suddenly put the brakes on the economy, and essentially housing construction stops or slows down considerably, right? So, I mean, shouldn't there be a way that federal policy is more sensitive to the way that capital access during a period of inflation shouldn't stop towards something that's a basic need of the society. Anyway, I interrupted you.
Well, I would say that it kind of goes back a little bit to the comment you raised, or the comment before about why is affordable housing structured around a model where people are profiting, right? That you have for-profit developers that develop affordable housing, and so a lot of to paraphrase your comment, that a lot of the push is toward in city ABS and other pieces of legislation toward figuring out how do we make this profitable. And you know this, but that model effectively has been the working model since the Reagan tax code in 1986, which introduced low-income housing tax credits, right? So since '86, the for-profit model of affordable housing is what we're going with. And good or bad or indifferent, it has produced way more housing than public housing ever did. So it is an effective tool. I have lots of critiques on that tool, and I certainly would critique, it's like, well, what is it, does it change? Does it change the design? Does it change the approach? Does it change the mindset if it's a for-profit entity? But or endeavor? But if at the end of the day, we need housing, and this is a tool that is building a lot of housing, it's tough to walk away from that. But I do think it's important that we start thinking about its alternatives. This project behind us, as a land trust, as a community-owned land trust, is an effort toward that. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting in your book is identifying all these different trends. I would say that sustainability has been a huge trend. More community engagement and participation in development of housing in New York City has been a huge trend. But I think what you're going to start to see is an exploration of alternate modes of ownership and tenure, which starts to move away from that. There was a really interesting piece of legislation that was proposed just a couple of months ago that all city-owned land had to go to a development entity, JV, whatever, that was either a community land trust or a community-owned. And it kind of stalled. But it was interesting that even made it into the discussion.
And there definitely is, I think, in New York. The term now is social housing. I think there's folks that I don't know. I mean, the irony is I think that the argument against profit in affordable housing in particular, I don't know if it's I think it's kind of off the mark, truthfully, because even non-for-profits that build 100% affordable housing derive a developer fee that they use in turn to often fund other parts of the mission. And the thing is that the developer fee that's structured in a tax credit deal, which is the most common kind of affordable housing financing tool, is actually that's the first thing that goes when there are overruns, right? So everybody else is getting paid for their effort. And if there's something goes sideways, then you take that, you start eating into that fee to cover the overruns, right? I'm on the board of a couple of non-for-profit housing developers here in New York City that, similarly, we kind of need those dollars to be able to chase the next project, pay for the pre-development of the next project, or pay for the organizing team, the community benefits team. So I don't actually, from a kind of the argument against, or trying to remove the profit motivation out of housing development, affordable housing development, I think gets lost because I think it's kind of a little misunderstood in what that profit motivation is. I don't think anybody's retiring off of it.
Let me just interject a little bit because I think that it's a bit misunderstood. What I would argue about the profit aspect of it. Yes, I totally agree that people's motivations often are not profit seeking. Precisely, there's a creative impulse to make something, and I don't think that the policy frameworks are designed to encourage that aspect of the motivation to make things to meet a need. The low-income housing tax credits, fine, but they don't supply nearly enough of them actually to make most projects possible. They have to wait years in order to get them sometimes. So they're very clumsy design policies that don't make enough capital accessible to the part of the market that sorely needs it. But I wanted to just maybe ask you if you would be willing to talk about the cooperative research that you were doing, if there's time, because it seems like a really productive area. I'm aware of huge developments in New York City that historically used a cooperative model. There were unions organizing to build huge developments for members. There's a Finnish cooperative model, where essentially, they're building something for a community themselves, but they also have to figure out how to get the project together, which is complicated.
Yeah, I'll talk about it briefly, and then we'll have a couple minutes for audience questions. I'm also interested to hear about how this disparate community land trust works, because most of the community land trusts I visited were working with existing stock or buying up single-family homes or developing in pretty disparate areas. But I mean, yeah, I think it's quite exciting to think of different models of tenure and ownership where it can be completely apart from the speculative market. I mean, it's apart from either subsidized or market rate, and it's a sort of circular way to keep funding. There in Copenhagen, you have the tenant's right of first refusal. So there's a lot of cooperatives because if someone wants to sell a building, they have to offer it to the tenants first, and then they get a chance to form together to buy it. An opportunity that we don't really have in Boston. I was renting a building, someone sold it. And then you have networks in Switzerland. I mean, there's the largest probably network, and they have the pension funds fund new cooperative housing. It's like it's a very standard way of building large-scale housing. Cooperative is a big word. There's rental cooperative, ownership cooperative, limited equity, different ways. But I think it's really exciting when it is a rental and at a way where people can have an influence in how their community is shaped and designed. There's a large provider, CHL, in Victoria in Australia. So they have hundreds of cooperatives and sort of operated like a subsidized rental housing institutional landlord, but each community maintains itself, both like the groundskeeping, the financial. They also had input on the design of the buildings. They get to change the buildings over time. But people just have a low standard rent, and you save money another way. Your 401k, you're in the market, and then you're secure in a community. Your wealth isn't tied up in your real estate, and there's some really interesting buildings that come out of it. But we'll talk more about this later, and maybe that's the next event. But I did want to have a couple moments. Maybe we have a microphone. If there's no questions, I will ask you. But is there any audience questions about anything at all that we've talked about?
Well, can I ask the first audience question? I think that it sounds to me like the creativity, we have the capacity as designers to scale buildings appropriately, right? I think that we can look at all of these great examples and remind ourselves around, how to make medium and low density housing interesting, how to make it contextual to New York City. But if financing is where we need to be most creative, I'm curious, through the research, you're talking a little bit about cooperatives. Are there other financial models or reasons why we can do this in other cities and not New York? Is it just a New York City problem?
Oh, we can't do this in Boston either, so I don't know where you can do this. I think regulation is a big part of it. Yeah. Any of you have a response?
Look, I think with a cooperative, either way you slice it, a cooperative or a single owner or any other entity, it's there has to be an ability to cover if we're talking about new housing, right? There has to be an ability to cover just that upfront cost, right? And so that's either there's just a huge backstop from the public sector to cover 190% of that cost, so that it can be truly affordable and cooperative like you're describing, where there is a low rent maintenance, right? Because it's not being used to pay down any debt, right? Or you do take on debt, and then there's the balancing act of like, how is that affordability maintained if there is debt? And it didn't matter who took on the debt, because now the debt is encumbering the property, and that's just real estate in the United States. A lien holder has the ability, basically controls the destiny of that property if that obligation is not met. And so I think trying to replicate the Penn Souths, the old Mitchellamas in today's world would require just a significant amount of public support, public sector, and I mean financial support. That's what I'm saying, because otherwise it doesn't. It's not going to pencil out because the contractor has to get paid, the architect has to get paid, whoever, right? And then affordable housing by definition is housing that cannot cover its own cost. So then who's making up that gap? And so I think, that's just like, the movement to your earlier point about like the federal government. The federal government has the biggest checkbook of anybody in the United States, and so they would have to then prioritize that, right, and make that a priority, and then create programs to be able to funnel it to the states to allow them to make that possible. And I think, I'm just kind of like laying it out because that's the way it would have to come about, right?
Yeah, I think to back up there, that's really a good point. There are some really interesting, cooperative development models where time is money, so they're willing to forego not having their home for maybe 8 years while they figure it out, and use sweat equity in a diverse array of ways than we're typically thinking about sweat equity for construction, but you'd have maybe 20 families that are willing to spend close to a decade, one of them as a developer in their job, so they can do that in their free time. It's time as money. It's using a lot of money if you valued their time, but it's not their job. And then you can make it happen on very strange sites, hard sites, with all the approvals that it would require. And they're doing it because they're going to create homes for themselves, but then it kind of stops, and they're not going to go develop another project. So it's like a one-off. And you do need a lot of city support money, but also disposition. In a lot of places, you need to dedicate disposition for these type of communities to happen because they don't have the resources to make it happen otherwise. And it's not going to fix large-scale housing issues, but it's going to help achieve diversity.
Thank you for that. So do we have any questions from the audience? There we go.
Hi. So you mentioned your project on the mid-size that you kind of want to steer away from now, right? Because it doesn't really add up. And talking about the financing of it, to my understanding, the city of Yes is more not besides the UAP, right? It's about supplying housing, right? Not just affordability of housing. It's just adding more supply to balance off the demand, right? And how your thoughts on if you took into account the 485X, the tax incentives that sort of replaces the 425A, and if you kind of took that into account.
That's a good question. The zoning changes and the zoning resolution only create, right? They just create the envelope, right? And they just have increased the envelope, increased the density. Yes, there is a UAP, the affordability preference. It's basically, so we had this thing called, we had voluntary inclusionary housing, which I think everybody's familiar with, right? And now the UAP is basically kind of not made it voluntary anymore. They kind of mapped it citywide. So now, because before when you had voluntary inclusionary housing, you could take the bonus and build more, but you had to do the 20% affordable, or you could not take the bonus and just build a smaller envelope. Now you don't have that second option anymore. If you're going to build, you're going to build it, and you're going to do the 20%, right? But I think, like I mentioned before, the property tax system also here is kind of weird, because if you decided that you wanted to take advantage of the UAP and you don't want to take this tax abatement, you have to then figure out how to make your project work, potentially paying 30% of your gross income toward property taxes. And that's often the deal killer. You just cannot cover the land, the construction costs, and the interest, and the debt service. So that's why it's funny though, because there's as developers, we kind of watch the reporting on like 421A was never an affordable housing production program. It evolved into that, right? And then people killed it because it wasn't a good enough affordable housing production program. the irony is the best affordable housing production program would be just to fix the property tax system that we have so that you wouldn't need this incentive, right? You wouldn't have to create it, but that's like another third rail, right? The white whale, the third rail, you just can't touch that. And so it's just all about just making projects feasible, right? And so, there's what they call that's tools in a toolbox, right? I'm an affordable housing developer, so I go to pretty much the same toolbox all the time, and that's right. And so, but I use different tools for different projects, right? So, and market rate guys, they don't want to mess with all those tools, right? So they just want to be, they want uncertainty. They want, okay, we have to build 20% affordable. Okay, I'll do it. I'll figure out how to cross-subsidize it. So my rents have to be high enough, or my sales prices have to be high enough, so that I don't need to ask anybody for public money, right? All I do is ask people for public money, because I want my projects to be 100% affordable, because I want to start putting them in pockets where, like to Brian's point, the non-traditional neighborhoods. But you are right. I think it just created the conditions for anybody, community land trusts, developers, non-for-profits, to have projects that maybe didn't work a month ago, and now they can work. So that's really, I think, what City of Yes did, and and I'm optimistic that it will yield and over time, 'cause, we needed a change. We couldn't, it's 2024. Using rules from 1962. I mean, some of them were kind of really ridiculous. And so, I mean, the ones that we were talking about before are some big ones, but there are a lot of small cleanups that were part of the program, part of the zoning text amendment.
We've got another question here.
It's actually kind of following up on the question you asked about financing. And I guess the question's really about alternate financing models, but not so much for affordable housing, because one would think that when you're looking at a market rate situation, you'd be able to pay for it. But when you look at these mid-rise projects, as an architect who has done them and also now starting to run numbers on them and seeing the tremendous opportunity in the tens of thousands of sites that are available, there's a huge opportunity to build tens, if not hundreds of thousands of units. What I've started to see is that the requirements to get funding private funding are sort of unrealistic to what these things can achieve. So with a little bit of adjustment to those expectations, it seems like one could build a tremendous amount of housing that would pencil, but it's just slightly different than the expectations now. So I'm wondering if there's any models in that private sector that are working that maybe one could look at or point to try to create more housing in this sort of scale.
I would say that this is officially preaching to the choir. We're in New York City, right? Your construction costs are unlike anywhere else in the country, and your land costs are unlike anywhere else in the country. So already you have an incredible hill to climb, and financial models that might be super creative and working in anyone from Minneapolis. Okay, in Minneapolis, aren't going to work here. I think, and this is part of what I thought, and not to sound like a rah-rah guy, but part of what I thought was really clever about City of Yes is it didn't say, okay, let's go make something totally new, especially as it related to UAP. It said, what do we already have on the boards or in the books, and let's just tweak that, right? So UAP in many ways is just heirs housing, but it's no longer age restricted. So I think one of the things that we really should do in this kind of next wave of trying to increase the provision of affordable housing in the city is look at the existing financial tools that we have and figure out what needs to change with those. So Open Door is an HPD HDC term sheet that's for affordable home ownership. How do we get that to work better? Because that could start to populate and finance the kind of projects that you're talking about. Mix and match is another tool. I think it's M2M is another tool that, in large part, those three are pretty heavily undersubscribed, and for good reason. So what needs to happen with those existing financial tools, as opposed to coming in with a whole new set of tools to make them work for the typology that you're talking about? That's where I think the conversation needs to go.
I think, on your question also, I mean, like just seller financing is also something that I think it's a interesting conversation to have if you're trying to purchase a site, and maybe the carry costs and then absorbing the site is really onerous. Trying to make a deal with the owner of the land and say, you can hold a piece of paper that I'll pay you, certain interest rate on, and then when the project is completed, so that you can drive down your cost of capital and get the project built, and that requires a patient seller, right? But you don't know unless you ask, right? That's my whole MO, right? I've gotten crazy requests from the city just because I opened my mouth, and so that. But I think this typology, the kind of the mid-rise stuff, I mean, like we were saying before, though, I think the regulatory environment and also I think the financing environment is going to catch up to what just happened today, right? It's like the way retail always catches up to residential, right? It just takes a little time. Some people are gonna have to make some mistakes, and other people are gonna have to figure it out, and then the herd will follow, right? And then the banks, the investors will see an opportunity, and they'll start figuring out. And as a developer, like to Ryan's point, if you're finding ways to be cost effective, that's the biggest way to, right, to make your deal financeable, right?
Do we have any final questions? We can also grab a glass of wine and linger a bit before we get kicked out. Yeah?
Don't be shy. Just let it go.
Don't
Let
be
it
shy.
rip.
Although I feel like
It's
that was
Thursday.
somewhat
It's
of a
Thursday in New
closing
York.
statement that was like,
Yeah, I
we
feel
just
like-
need to be patient and it will work itself out, which, could be a perfect way to end the conversation. Either way.
That sounds great. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to everyone online who are still here, and let's grab a drink. Thank you.